Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gene Luedtke. I'm the president of the Carnegie Historical Museum here in Fairfield, the place where you're at right now. It's great to see such a big crowd here today. Joanne, you're popular.
Oh boy.
It's great. We're very fortunate to have Joanne give a program today. We try to have one program a month here at the museum. We'll have another one in 2 weeks when Bob and Martha Rasmussen are going to do one on Christmas. And then the next program will be early January, where we're doing another Parsons College program, and we're trying to emphasize athletics on that, whether it's people from Fairfield that played there, the recruiting, those experiences they had. So that will be the second Sunday in January. We're fortunate to have FPAC filming again today. It enables the museum to reach a lot of people in the community who normally aren't able to come to the programs. It's a great way to have an outreach program for the museum. We appreciate everybody that comes, and I always think it's the most interesting when you're right here, but it's also fun for those people to review the program on the FPAC at a later time. Our program today is Joanne Angell, and Joanne, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself farther and what you're going to be doing today.
All right,
Okay.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
All right. Well, I'm really pleased to be here, and as I say, I'm so glad to see many friends and relatives and acquaintances. A few years ago, I came into possession of my great-great-grandfather's writ, or diary, of the Civil War. He was in 2 years and 2 days. I have done some genealogy work, and we have discovered in our family that my husband was related distantly to Stonewall Jackson. As it said in the paper, he ran away and joined the Union side. Well, that's not quite true. His sister supported the Union side the whole time of the war and worked with the people that were wounded and worked with them. I have permission from Jay Ungar, who is one of our up-and-coming fiddle composers. If you listen to the show on public television of the Civil War, there was a very beautiful song that went in the background all the time. I have his permission to do it for live performances only. And it's called the Ashokan Farewell. That is not someone saying goodbye to anything, that is a river. As you all know, I think all of us have relatives that lived on the north and the south. Even some families were divided. The main thing, they say they went to war, was to free the slaves on the North for the Emancipation Proclamation. But that really truly wasn't the only thing that they went to war for. It was for the Congress of the commerce of selling produce and the goods that they had. The Southerners have an entirely different lifestyle. It never gets as cold. They have more dreamy times. I always thought when they had all these slaves that they had lots of free time and they could do their thing, which was like hunting and running around and partying. But the more I read into some of this history, you know, the ladies of the, they had to do a lot of work. They were making clothes all the time for the slaves. They were trying to feed them. They were trying to keep everything organized. Even though they had help in the house, they still had lots of duties related to taking care of people. The slaves, they really had a very hard time, some of them. Some of them, they were just like family. Stonewall Jackson owned 2 slaves in his lifetime. One of them was an older lady who was very crippled, and her plantation owner went bankrupt. And she was going to be sold down the river. And she came to Stonewall, where he was teaching at the Virginia Institute, and asked if he would buy her so she could stay there, because she was afraid she would die on her trip down the Mississippi. So he did purchase her. I don't know how much. Another one was a gentleman by the name of Jem, and he was sort of a servant of, and almost a free man. So he bought him from the same owner, and he paid him to work, and let him go to work for other people so he get the money to pay him back for him buying him so he could be a free man. They wrote lots of good music, toe-tapping music, music that we really like to listen to. And one of them, if you use the Negro words, they were really having a good time with this song, and it's Golden Slippers. Well, as I said in the paper, it wasn't quite right, but it was a lot of similarities between my great-great-grandfather and Stonewall. Their fathers died. Stonewall was 3 when his father died. My father died when he was 10. Both ladies married again, not to their advantage. When Stonewall's mother married again, he had a sister and a brother. The brother later died. He and his sister were quite close. They went to stay with relatives because his mother was quite ill part of the time. And she finally called them to her deathbed and asked them to always remember her and to be with them. On my great-grandfather's side, it was not a happy thing there either. As Henry mentions about in his writ, this man was not like his father. His father was a jovial time, told him stories, they sang together, they did things together. This man was very demanding. His name was Mr. Erskine. And some way they moved from Ottumwa back to Indiana and Illinois. In the back of this writ, there are letters from my cousin, Lucille, and she has letters that my great-great-great-grandmother wrote to my great-great-grandfather after the war up until the time she died. And she did not have a good life after she had remarried. They were living in Compantine Township in Ottumwa. When he was 15, like I said, he did not get along with his stepfather. And one time the stepfather was cleaning his bayonet for drill. And when he did that, about that time, I guess Henry told him what he thought of him. And he was threatened with the bayonet, and he decided that made him mad enough he was going to leave. There was money enough for him to have some money, but the stepfather refused to let the neighbor that was holding it give it to him. Stonewall taught at the Virginia Institute. He had very little education because he had stayed with his uncle, and everything was so primitive. We get in our cars and go now. We cannot realize how long it took to get to different places. That, you know, like if I came in today for the show, I would have had to start this morning to make sure I got here to have everything ready. Stonewall, when he went to West Point, he lucked out getting into West Point. One of the neighbor boys went, did not like the discipline there, and he left. So Stonewall got on the ball, and he wrote all kinds of letters to everyone and had people write letters for and then he got into West Point. There were around 69 in his class when they started at West Point. He was almost at the bottom because he had very, very limited education. By the time he left his senior year, he was 17th in the class. He would stay up nights and he would study by the glow of the fire in the fireplace. He was so determined he was going to get an education. One of his best battle places was in the Valley of the Virginias, which is Shenandoah. The songs from the South have a more plaintive feel to them most of the time. The people had a more dreamy approach to music. We know that from Stephen Foster, and he took the songs that he heard and he made them into this part of the literature of the South. They had fun with music too. They must have been like Paul Ingalls was in the Little House on the Prairie series. To get through all the work that they had to do in the field and everything, they made up songs to go along. See that watermelon a-smiling through that fence. How I wish that watermelon was mine. Farmers are so foolish, they really have no sense, or they wouldn't leave that watermelon on the vine. Ham bone is sweet, chicken and good, rabbit is so very, very fine. But give me, how I wish you would, that good old sweet watermelon hanging from that vine. You can talk about your apples, your peaches, and your pears. Simmons are hanging from that tree. But give me, how I wish you would, that good old watermelon hanging from that vine. I went to get that melon, it was a Sunday night. Stars, they were just beginning to shine. But when I left the melon patch, I left there on the run. But I didn't leave that watermelon behind. Give me, how I wish you would. That good old sweet watermelon hanging from that vine. Thank you. They had lots of love songs. Like I said, even though the plantation ladies had to work quite hard, they were much revered by their husbands, and so were their mistresses. They sang lots of songs to them. And one of them that is a favorite of my cousin, Lucille, when she went to reenact was Lorena. Very beautiful, haunting melody. Well, Stonewall got in the service. He took some of the people from the Institute, and they're the ones that oversaw the hanging of John Brown. He made the comment one time that this man looks so normal to have such feelings against the South. And that he was a very nice looking man. I have been through his home, which is in Nebraska City. I don't know. I saw pictures of him there, and he didn't look like that great a looking a man to me. Stonewall, when he first went in, he wasn't real well known to General Lee and to Jeff Davis. He did not care for Jeff Davis. He said he is the most wishy-washy man that he had ever met in his life. He told that to his second wife. He and my great-great-grandfather were married twice. Their first spouses died. My great-great-grandfather had a daughter and a son, and the son was the one that died in his first marriage, and the same happened with Stonewall. They both remarried, and I think they were fairly happy, and I think they had found their true loves when they married the second time. They had a stillborn baby, Stonewall did, when it only lived, well, I take that back, it only lived about a month. Its name was Mary. Now, Stonewall's second wife came from a moneyed family with a quite large plantation, and they lived quite well. When she went to the Virginia Institute, she didn't know. They had a room with other people, and Stonewall had always wanted a family and a home. And finally, just before the war, they got their home. And it was large, but they had people come and stay with them. Their parents sent slaves from where she had come from, and they also stayed there at the Institute. There were people that were trying to help move the slaves north. And we have places in Keosauqua. We have places here in town where we have the Underground Railroad has gone. Anytime you want to go down and see a very interesting one that you can even go down in the hole, is down in Salem. That's very interesting. At one time there were some artifacts stolen from there, and one of them was a handmade gun made by one of my relatives, a Van Trump, on my husband's side. And they really took a lot from that, but they have replaced some of it now. They had, we've all heard of the ladies that would go down and help bring the people back. There's been movies on that, But there was another man. His name was Peg-Leg Pete. And the slave owners could tell when he had been there, because he left little round places every place where he had walked. And this is sort of a song for Peg-Leg Pete. The drinking gourd, of course, is the Big Dipper. And they would follow it. And there are quilts that were made in that time that would have the rivers in them and everything where they were, how they could go. And it was a map for the people to run away. They did use the rivers a lot because in the bloodhounds lost their scent. Now, things were tough in the South after the war got started. Their rations were bad. They did not commission food and have the background that the people from the North had. But they had something that they had to eat, which we eat today, good old Goober peas. When they'd had a lot of these rations, not to get downwind, because it could be dangerous. All right. In that time, they didn't have a fiddler that went along. It was like the Revolutionary War. They had buglers and everyone that went along with them. And they would have these little brass things, and they would, if they had someone playing with the drums and tooting along, they could march faster. So there's a song called Stonewall Jackson's Way. And it's got a nice little lilt to it. So the soldiers, they would march a lot faster. Well, Stonewall was very sneaky. Sometimes they would have, he would be one place, he would march the men all night long and part of the next day and show up where they least expected him to be. Well, he sort of came to a sad end. One day he went out reconnoitering for a battle. And he had this habit that he started, and he'd have his hand up in the air. And in fact, he lost one finger in an earlier battle, and his horse got shot in the rump. But other than that, he had never been wounded. Well, he was out, and one of the other companies from one of the other states did not know who he was. They shot him 3 times. He fell off of his horse. He was never able to recover from it. He had pneumonia. His wife came to his side. She said, remember the thing, how you got your name? They were so close. At one of the battles, there was a Stonewall, and Stonewall would not give up. He kept his men. They protected the others around them, and he persevered. And one of the generals said, Beauregard, I think it was, said, well, if we'd had all of the men standing like a stone wall, we would have won the war. And this is how he came with his nickname, Stonewall Jackson. Well, after he died, I really hate to tell you people up north, but we had some southern people here that enjoy the South and would have been maybe on the South. I'm afraid that if he would have lived, we might not be the United States. We might be the Confederacy. There were 2 battles that he wanted to take his men and go on into Washington. He could have captured Washington, but they didn't know him that well. They didn't know that he had this drive, and they made him stop, and his men stopped. I don't know. They said that after he died, that was the beginning of the end of the Confederacy. Well, about this time, here comes along my relative, about 4 months after Stonewall died. This boy, an ancestor of mine, when he was a boy, they had 2 books that he and his cousins, the Shearers, read together up in Wapello County. One of them was the life of George Washington, and the other one was of another very famous soldier. The minute they heard of the firing of Fort Sumter, they were ready to go, but they weren't old enough. But every one of them in that neighborhood went. Grandpa Henry was the only one. He was in the Iowa 8th L Division. He had to leave, like I said, without any money. And so when they got, he had to walk to join up. And when he did, he didn't have any money to have any food. And a lot of the other guys didn't either. So the commanding officer, I think it was Penny, P-I-N-N-E-Y, Penny. They thought, oh, he's a good guy, because he went into town, he bought what we would call lunch meat now, cheese and bread, and gave it to all the guys to eat. They'll come to find out later it came from the money that the guys had put in, and he wasn't such a good guy after all. Well, when they started south, they went to a little town in Indiana. And I still have a lot of relatives that live in Indiana, and I went to visit some of them when I was a wee, skinny child. And yeah, I remember they even had chickens sleeping on the end of the bed. It was, I was little. And they were right along someplace where it was sandy. And they had gotten their horses at Davenport and everything, and they had shipped them there. Well, he said they pulled them all in together, and I never did get the same horse again. But he said we tried to eat, and everything was covered with sand. They got on a train, and they headed south, and most of the time of the war, he was around Nashville, Tennessee. And on the train, he said we didn't know what we were getting into. We finally got our education courtesy of the United States Army. But this is one of the songs that they sang on the train going south. That was the gal I left behind me. And there's one time he talked about they were on leave, and he was in Nashville, and he had his picture taken, one for his mother, who is his very best friend, he says at the end of the writ, and the other was for the gal he left behind me. But he was robbed, and they disappeared. So we don't have that. They got homesick. They all did, north and south. And Home Sweet Home was a song that they sang quite often around the fireplace. A little bit going back to Stonewall's side, on Carol's side, a lot of them after the war came to Illinois and settled around Jacksonville, or part of them went over to St. Genevieve in Missouri. In my research that I've done, now this is all sort of sponsored by the Iowa Arts Council and the National Endowment for the Arts. In my research while I was in Illinois, I found that William Emsley Jackson, one of Carol's relatives, was a circuit riding preacher for the Methodist Church around Jacksonville, Illinois. This is a song, this is not written during the Civil War, but this is written by, I sort of like bluegrass music because it sort of goes back to the Appalachian sounds. And this is a song called The Methodist Preacher. The Methodist Preacher is written by Bill Monroe. Anyone that knows bluegrass, you know where that one came from. He ended up going through the march through Georgia. He had a very interesting time. As you know, in the paper the other night, they told the one about the company. He was one of the providers, or otherwise he was one of the ones that went out and stole food. And one night they got a hold of a paymaster's wagon, and they'd hit the jackpot. It was full of Confederate money. So they used it to play poker, and they would go out and buy provisions with this money they had gotten from the Confederates, and they thought they were getting rich when they were really stealing their food. They went to this one farm place, and there was a lady with a passel of kids. And so there were a few of them in the bunch, and they were just going to take her meal and her food, and she says, well, you know, if you'll play me a game of cards, then I win, I get to keep my food. So they used the baby's cradle and blanket, and one of the guys in the company played cards, but she won. She fixed him a meal, and they went on down the road. So you just never knew. One time he was very close to Nashville, and they came upon this beautiful mansion, absolutely gorgeous mansion. There wasn't a soul around, and they figured the people from the South had taken off and departed. Saw his first piano that he'd ever seen. He saw the first bed with bed springs like on it that wasn't a rope thing or feather ticks. He laid down on that to try that out. But someone had gotten in the basement, and they had molasses in the basement. They'd taken and got the bungs out of the barrels of molasses, and it was inches deep in molasses in the basement. But he saw some things that he said he never would have seen if he hadn't gone to war. Towards the end, they hit towns around Macon, and some of his division were the ones that captured Jefferson Davis. He said that they promised not to harm anything, not to burn anything more, so they were ready to go home. They were tired of war. He said, I saw things that I wish I could never forget. There were battles, but he said there were some times on Lookout Mountain when they went there, he says, I looked over the most beautiful scenery and the most beautiful things that I had ever seen. So he said there was good and there was bad with what he had seen. So they were ready to go home. And I think the South was more than ready to get rid of war, I'll tell you. So he was put on a train. They took their bullets and their guns. They had a couple run-ins with a couple Negro troops on their way north. Luckily, they knew they had no ammunition, so nothing was done. They got to Chicago. They got on a real train because before they hadn't been on passenger cars. They had been on like cattle cars. And every time they made a stop across Illinois, they would give them apples and food to eat and everything. They went across the river into Clinton, and that's where he was mustered out of the service, was in Clinton, Iowa. He then went on a train to Washington, and then from Washington to Fairfield, he hired a horse rig to bring him to Ottumwa, and he walked the last 8 miles home. He said his mother was the last one to see him go. She met him at the gate. He doesn't know how she knew, but she met him at the gate, and he was so thrilled to see her. Going back to the circuit riding preacher, there was a song, and I'm going to use a tune of it for the beginning of this, that was used to keep the South and the North really separated, because the Southern people did not care for this song. The circuit riding preacher used to ride across this land with his rifle in his saddle and his Bible in his hand. He told the prairie people all about the promised land as he went riding, singing down the trail, leaning, leaning, leaning on the everlasting arms, leaning, leaning, leaning on the everlasting arms. The circuit riding preacher used to ride through mire and mud. He told of Daniel, the fire and the flood. He told them the way to heaven was through fire and the blood, as he went riding, singing down the trail. Please join along. Power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. Oh, there's power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Now, we're going to do the version that made the South a little upset. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Sing along. He is trampling out the vintage, the grapes of wrath are stored. He lit the fearful lighting of his terrible swift sword as he went marching on. Everyone now. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. His truth is marching on. As you know, I like to quilt. From this man's, it would be his great-great-granddaughter. I would go visit on the farm. And one thing that they loved to do in my father's family, and they had to do a lot, there were 14 children, they had to make a lot of quilts. This is a little quilt I made one time. And this is what has happened to all of us, even though we were victorious over the South. My grandfather said they just weren't as well prepared. They were much better shots. They could do things much better on horse than we could. But anytime the battle lasted more than 2 days, they lost. Like Gettysburg, they started out winning. They just were not as organized. And that's where I think if Stonewall maybe had lived, things would have been better. But you notice all these little boats going around the outside, that's like our disjointed lives. And we join them all together where it's a star. And we put all those stars together, we have the United States. Now, I have had a relative, ever since the Revolutionary War, one of my relatives on the McVeigh side, Thompson side, have been in battle. We lost one of mine that I remember most. It was a cousin very close to my age. He was in the Korean War. He was captured, made to march a long ways, and he did not make it. In the Reader's Digest a few years ago, there was a write-up, and one of the men had taken and written on anything he could find to write down the name of all these people that were dying on the death marches. They destroyed one. They found one. He still had this one. Ronnie's name, Ronnie Thompson, is still on there. I saw the thing that came from the government at our last family reunion. We had it watch here. And it was sad. He was a man, in fact, he was my grandmother's favorite grandchild. She liked him so well. She was sneaky. She would put pennies at different places around the parlor and have you go in to clean. If you didn't find all the pennies, you didn't clean very good. And if she had pennies that she left on the kitchen table, this kid was the only one that never asked what those pennies were sitting there for and asked if they could have one. I guess the rest of us were greedy. There's an old fiddle tune that I like really well. I'll show this first. This is not anything that I have made. I purchased this at a garage sale for about $4. I don't know. The lady must not like her mother-in-law too well. But, you know, we're all united now. And more so after the things that happened in September. My grandson is back from Afghanistan. Praise the Lord, his C-17 wasn't shot down. He was one of the ones that dropped food over Afghanistan. He is home now in Charleston, South Carolina. It just seems like there are people that hate too easily. My grandfather said it's in the end of the writ. He says he hopes that none of his sons and grandsons will ever have to go to war again. He didn't want to see Old Glory being drug in the dirt. But if we had to give her all, we could give her all. So I'm going to close this presentation today with Under the Double Eagle. Not too long ago, around decoration time, there was a story, and I think it's so wonderful in some ways. This general saw this body lying out on the battlefield. The guys didn't know whether to go out or not, whether they would get shot, but he went out and drugged this man back in the dark. They got him by the firelight, and they looked. It was his own son that he had rescued. In his pocket were some notes. This boy, the dad was a Union general. This boy had gone to school to train in music in the South. He was killed. He enlisted while he was down in the South. He had enjoyed the life there so much. Well, the general, they went to bury the boy, and the other commanders said, no, you can't use the group that we usually use to bury people. You can only have one person. So he chose a trumpeter. And he played the notes that were in that boy's pocket. And that's how we come up with this. Thank you very much for being a very good audience today. And thank you, Gene, for having me. And like I say, I do have copies of the writ, the letters that were written later, Stonewall Jackson's a summation of his life, and other things that are in the book, which are $10. Just my cost into them. Partly sponsored by the Iowa Arts Council and the National Endowment for the Arts.
Joanne, thank you very much. Again, let's have a good round of applause. A couple of personal thoughts. One is I just don't think there's an instrument anywhere like the fiddle that can have the whole array of emotions that you can have from that one instrument. The second thing is, how many here had ancestors that fought in the Civil War?
2 of them.
Okay, so it's about a third of the people here, or at least a fourth of the people here, and I think that's interesting that the Civil War touched so many families still. The other thing is, you mentioned transportation. Fairfield's own General Parsons, the son of the founder of Parsons College, was the head of transportation during the Civil War. And many of General Parsons' artifacts are in our display here at the end, and you're welcome to look at those after the program. One other interesting thing is we have a horn over here that was from the Civil War, and the sound always went to the back with the horns because the band was always in front. And of course the sound had to go to the back. Just one of those interesting things that I always think about when I see that display. So everyone, thank you very much for coming, and again, FPAC, thank you for filming today. Richard Thompson does a tremendous job for us, and we thank you. So, in closing, thank you again, Joanne.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.